Okay, let's unpack this. We're taking a deep dive specifically for you, based on the material you've shared with us. And that material describes a country that sounds, well, like a place of fascinating contradictions. Intense beauty, too. I mean, imagine a disco house somehow built inside a 300-year-old stone castle. Or the tallest sea cliff in Europe just plunging into the Atlantic. Plus, unique local wines you might not find anywhere else. And a surprising sense of affordability once you step outside the busiest tourist hubs.
It really is a place where the natural beauty is striking. You have these well-kept rivers and forests, inland, dramatic hills, and of course that powerful Atlantic coastline. The sources definitely paint a picture of a country deeply connected to its land, its light, and yeah, that sometimes bizarre, unexpected beauty. It feels like parts are internationally recognized, sure, Lisbon, the Algarves, but also in many ways still waiting to be fully discovered by lots of people.
Right. And our mission with this deep dive is really to cut through the noise, yeah. Extracting the essential nuggets of knowledge and insight from this material, helping you get well informed about Portugal's rich, complex story without feeling, buried in information overload.
Oh, it's quite a story. We're going to journey from its deep ancient roots, explore a moment when this seemingly small country had an unbelievable global influence, navigate periods of major upheaval and change, and bring it right up to its contemporary challenges and that vibrant, enduring culture. And honestly, there's some truly surprising findings waiting in these sources.
So let's jump right in and set the scene, starting with the land itself. Where does Portugal actually sit on the map, and what does that tell us?
Okay, so Portugal occupies the absolute westernmost edge of the Iberian Peninsula. It's relatively compact, about 92,000 square kilometers on the mainland, plus its crucial Atlantic island groups.
Yeah.
The Azores and Madeira, you can't forget those. Its only land border is with Spain. Everywhere else, it just faces the vastness of the Atlantic. The material describes it as having a sturdy, often mountainous landform, a narrow coastal plain, and benefiting from, a favored Mediterranean climate.
And the history here stretches back way further than you might initially think. The sources point to an incredibly rich prehistory.
Absolutely. We're talking deep time, going back into the Paleolithic era. What's fascinating is how much of our understanding of these earliest periods relies purely on archaeology. While Greek and Roman accounts give us glimpses of societies just before their arrival for the truly ancient layers, archaeology is, well, it's the primary way we uncover that past.
And it sounds like that story is still being written, still unfolding.
Constantly, yeah. Archaeological sites continue to yield new information. And some of the latest research highlighted in the sources suggests the Iberian Peninsula is actually among the oldest territories settled by modern humans in Europe. It's seen as particularly favorable for studying those early populations from both an ecological and geographical standpoint. The serious study of this really kicked off in Portugal around the mid-19th century.
Speaking of arrivals, the Romans made a massive impact, didn't they? The sources mention their conquest starting way back in 218 BC.
They certainly did. But it wasn't a quick takeover, It took over 2 centuries for the conquest to be complete. The real large-scale Romanization process, integrating the territory into the empire, got seriously underway under Emperor Augustus. They carved out major provinces, including Lusitania, which covered a significant chunk of modern Portugal.
And they weren't subtle about establishing their presence, I gather.
Not at all, no. They built a permanent, lasting infrastructure, sophisticated networks of postal and commercial routes, strategically placed fortified towns and settlements. It's amazing many of these are still inhabited today, testaments to that era. It was all designed for control and facilitating trade, and honestly, the practical benefits often helped gain acceptance for Roman rule.
They brought their whole way of life with them too, right?
Yeah.
Their systems.
Exactly. A whole new set of norms, sociopolitical behaviors, even the Roman civitas model, which was essentially their framework for political inclusion and urban administration. That was imposed. And it gradually changed, sometimes undermined, existing local structures. They were quite strategic about building a network of a new diplomatic elite to support their new order. And the architectural legacy is huge. They built monumental structures, and while early ones mirrored Rome, later ones in Iberia drew on older local traditions too. So you get this style that was diverse but somehow felt connected. Aesthetically coherent is how the source puts it.
Okay, so after the Romans left their mark, who came next in this story?
Well, following the decline of Roman power, we see the arrival of the Visigoths. Their incursions began around 418 AD. This led to their settlement, particularly in the north, in a region they called Galatia. By the end of the 10th century, their presence across the peninsula was quite extensive.
And then came a really dramatic, rapid shift with the Moorish conquest.
Yes, What the sources highlight here is the incredible speed of that conquest. Around 711 AD, a Berber general named Tariq bin Ziyad crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, and in barely a decade, he led campaigns that conquered vast swaths of southern Iberia. It was lightning fast.
That kind of speed suggests internal weaknesses, right? Things weren't solid.
Precisely. The sources point directly to internal issues within the Visigothic kingdom. It had only recently been unified, and there were deep divisions. You had the Visigoth rulers who were Arian Christians governing a largely Catholic peasant population. Big divide there. Plus, the reigning King Roderick had seriously alienated powerful elites, particularly in the south. And these elites actually looked across the straits to the rising Islamic power for support.
Ah, so internal conflict basically opened the door.
Essentially, yes. The result was a peninsula fundamentally divided, a Christian stronghold solidified in the north, Asturias, and this huge new Islamic world established across the rest of Iberia. It's interesting, though, according to the material, this initial conquest didn't immediately trigger major linguistic or cultural overhauls in the south, although the architectural impact was clear, with many bishopric temples transformed or their materials just reused.
Which leads us nicely to the story of how Portugal emerges from this dynamic, becoming its own distinct kingdom.
Right. So if we connect this to the broader picture of the Reconquista, the gradual Christian reconquest of the Peninsula Leon emerged as the first lasting Christian kingdom in the 11th century. Portugal began its life slightly differently, as a peripheral marchland, kind of a frontier zone west of the Douro River Valley.
And the sources point to a key figure in solidifying this territory. Yeah.
They do. Henry of Portugal. He became count of this region in 1096. His successors, most notably his son Afonso I, then dedicated the next decades to conquering and consolidating territory from the Moors, pushing southwards. The key steps towards the kingdom's consolidation happened relatively early, really in the 12th century.
And Afonso was seen as the first king. That's the guy.
Yes, Afonso I is recognized as becoming king in 1157, following crucial battle victories over Muslim-held cities. The material we have even contains a reference linking the very origin of the state back to a civil war in 1139. Interesting detail. Anyway, by the late 13th century, the Kingdom of Portugal had really risen to prominence among the Iberian states.
But that prominence brought new challenges, I imagine. Bigger neighbors.
It did. The unification of Leon and Castile under a single crown in 1230 created a much larger, more powerful neighbor right next door, which immediately posed a threat to Portugal's independence. This led to war, inevitably. But Portugal managed to secure victories in major battles throughout the 13th century, which were absolutely crucial for its continued growth in size and wealth through further conquests in the south.
And this period of consolidation seems to set the stage for what Portugal is perhaps most famous for globally. The age of discoveries.
It's quite a pivot, isn't it? Think about it. In the early 15th century, Portugal, as described in the sources, was actually a small, peripheral, mainly agricultural country. It was facing pressures on its border with Castile. That limited viability of focusing only on land, combined with maybe less success on the land border, really drove a new strategy.
Turn to the sea. Look outwards.
Exactly. They essentially adopted West Africa as a model for expansion and turned their focus overseas. This marked the beginning of the overseas empire. They invested heavily in building fleets and undertook extensive conquests between 1405 and 1505, places like Ceuta and Tangier in North Africa, among others mentioned in the material. It's remarkable. In about a century, Portugal transformed from that small peripheral kingdom into what the sources describe as a large and central country by 1578. Quite a change.
And this global push was deeply tied to Portugal's role as a center for trade, even before that.
Oh, absolutely. Portugal was blessed with a geographically privileged position in the late Middle Ages. It was sitting right between the major urban centers of continental Europe and the Atlantic and Baltic nations. Cities like Lisbon and Porto became real hubs, attracting merchants from across Europe. Think places like Manchester, London, Venice, Seville, loads more.
Lisbon must have just exploded during this time.
It grew incredibly fast. The kings of the Aviz dynasty granted urban privileges, fostered maritime traffic through public companies, and drew in significant numbers of foreign immigrants who often found real financial success there. It was a land of opportunity for some. This burst of commercial activity was supported by home monopoly and taxation, with a lot of Portugal's wealth actually being generated and transacted within the country itself. You saw high sums invested in banks, consumption became much more visible, Lisbon's streets and squares really brightened up compared to the rural areas, apparently.
The sources touch on the figures who contributed to this glory, but note it's not a perfectly clear picture, is it?
Yeah, the material indicates that pretty vague ideas still prevail about who truly contributed most significantly to the glory of the Portuguese name and domain. It suggests that perhaps those who simply sought royal favor weren't always the most impactful, and that people of courage and wisdom from less privileged backgrounds might be overlooked in the traditional accounts. Something to think about.
Okay, so from that peak of influence, Portugal then faced a major setback in the Iberian Union.
Ah, yes. This period from 1580 to 1640 is described in the sources as arguably the most controversial political event in Portuguese history, a bitter loss of independence. While the idea was that Portugal and Spain would remain separate kingdoms under the Castilian crown, in practice, the Castilian crown exerted control over the entire Portuguese empire, and this inevitably led to infringements on Portuguese rights and interests.
So it wasn't exactly a happy union, despite the official line.
Far from it, no. Spanish policy elsewhere in their vast empire in places like the Spanish Netherlands, Brazil, or regarding the slave trade directly impacted Portuguese trade interests. Big time. And while Spanish oppression over commerce and taxation is often pointed to as the main reason for discontent, the sources offer an interesting nuance here. They highlight that significant public discontent actually existed before the Union began, and that many of the loudest complaints often came from members of the high nobility, not necessarily representing a purely popular uprising across the board. Also, failure to interfere in religious conflicts and the impact of Spanish policy on their global trade networks really hurt Portuguese interests too.
All of this built up eventually to the restoration of independence.
December 1st, 1640, hugely important date. A revolt on that day, primarily led by the nobility, resulted in the capture of San Jorge Castle in Lisbon and the proclamation of independence. John IV, the Duke of Braganza, was quickly enthroned as the new king.
And Spain just accepted this, rolled over.
No, not at all. Not a chance. This triggered the long-running Restoration War. Spain didn't finally acknowledge Portuguese independence until much, much later, with the Treaty of Lisbon in 1664. The sources note that the Habsburg kings in Spain had really neglected Portugal in favor of managing their wider empire, you see. And this certainly fueled the resentment that led to the revolt. They felt sidelined.
Did Portugal find allies during this struggle? Anyone willing to help?
Yes. Interestingly, France and England openly sympathized with Portugal's cause. Now, this wasn't entirely altruistic, of course. The increasing power of the Spanish monarchy was seen as a threat to the European balance of power, maybe even the world order, so it gave France and England strategic reasons to support Portuguese independence. Smart politics. Portugal engaged in quite clever clandestine negotiations and a diplomatic offensive to secure this backing. There were also significant propaganda efforts within Portugal itself to legitimize the restoration, including actively vilifying the Habsburgs, painting them as the bad guys.
Okay, so after regaining independence, Portugal faced a completely different kind of disaster in the 18th century.
The devastating Lisbon earthquake of 1755. Catastrophic. Much of the subsequent period of rebuilding and reform was driven by one key figure, the Marquês de Pombal, who served as the Secretary of State.
His name is so closely linked to the reconstruction of Lisbon, isn't it?
Absolutely. Over 24,000 buildings in Lisbon were rebuilt, largely in a new, distinct style that came to be known as Pombaline architecture. Very ordered, very planned. They created wide, ordered streets, deep sidewalks, magnificent squares. The sources describe Lisbon during this era as essentially the first urbanist capital in Europe, intentionally designed to be open and facing towards the infinite seas. A real statement.
But his influence went beyond just bricks and mortar, right?
Oh, yes. Pombal was central to efforts to recover Lisbon's external trade. He also pushed through significant legislative reforms mentioned in the material, like creating the Imprensa Regia, which was essentially the royal press, a key tool for official communication and, well, control. And he engaged in a notable struggle with the Inquisition, trying to curb its power. His period of power ended with the accession of Maria I in 1777, which the sources say ushered in a phase of increased free thinking.
Moving into the 19th century now, the sources discuss the arrival of liberalism. How did that play out?
Well, the hardships faced under earlier absolute monarchs and the political turmoil and civil wars that followed the fall of the absolute monarchy between 1820 and 1823, including the ousting of D. Miguel in 1834, all that really stirred social consciousness. People were ready for change. Liberal ideas found fertile ground, seeking to establish defense through law and pushing hard for a constitution and a parliament. Basic rights, representation. The example of the Spanish Constitution of 1812 in particular was quite influential next door.
And this momentum eventually led to the end of the monarchy altogether.
It did. The establishment of the First Republic on October 5, 1910, is presented as the culmination of a long process. It was rooted in a deep, multifaceted crisis affecting the monarchy in its final decade. Things were really falling apart.
What kind of crisis were they facing? What were the issues?
The sources list several interconnected things. A crisis of the political system itself, naturally, significant social and economic problems like rising unemployment and poverty, a colonial crisis intertwined with burgeoning nationalism fueled by conflicts in Africa, even educational, representational, and psychological crises are mentioned, a whole complex mess.
Wow. Okay. But despite these internal struggles, the sources highlight some enduring strengths from that era that look outward, things that lasted.
They do, yeah. They point to the historical importance of water management in the Iberian Peninsula, which led to the development of dams and irrigation, a policy that continues effectively today. Portugal's renowned exports are also mentioned, things like its famous wines, conserves, fruits, liqueurs, minerals, still important. And the achievement of almost exclusive maritime domain in the Atlantic, including securing the Azores and Madeira, is described as creating a nascent Portuguese subcontinent with extraordinary potential, supported by significant investments in art and the recognized authenticity of Portuguese folklore.
Okay, fast forward to the 20th century, and Portugal entered a long period of authoritarian rule.
Yes, this was the Estado Novo regime, which held power from 1933 until April 25, 1974. A long stretch. It's characterized as a dictatorial and authoritarian period, largely dominated by Antonio de Oliveira Salazar. He had a background as a university professor and gained prominence for his success in implementing severe austerity measures as finance minister before becoming prime minister. That's how he got power.
What was the actual nature of that regime? What did it feel like?
It was very conservative and protectionist. It actively suppressed political opposition by nullifying freedoms of opinion and organization, relying heavily on political repression, secret police, censorship, all that. It allowed only one official party and worked tirelessly to suppress any clandestine opposition. The sources also note that this period saw increasing social injustices. It wasn't a good time for many.
Which brings us to a defining moment in modern Portuguese history, a real turning point.
The Carnation Revolution on April 25, 1974, absolutely pivotal. What makes this historically significant and frankly quite remarkable is its character as a peaceful transition to democracy. Almost unbelievable, really. It was led by the Armed Forces Movement, a group within the military itself.
So it was primarily a military action, not a popular uprising in the streets at first.
The sources make a point of highlighting this, despite the absence of a large pre-existing civilian movement actively driving the overthrow at that exact moment. The military succeeded in removing the regime with astonishingly limited casualties. I think only 3 people were killed during the entire operation. It's incredible.
That feels almost miraculous after nearly 50 years of dictatorship.
It really does. After 48 years of authoritarian rule, it wasn't a bloody uprising. It was a military movement where soldiers were famously offered carnation flowers by the public, which they placed in their rifle barrels, giving the revolution its powerful name and symbolism. Just an amazing image. It gained admiration globally, even inspiring a broader movement for democracy that some dubbed the Portuguese miracle. The material emphasizes these unique aspects, the military acting seemingly on behalf of the people despite not having massive public support, driving the initial coup, the incredibly delicate power transfer, and it being a genuinely successful, peaceful revolution without significant pre- or post-revolution mass violence. Really quite unique.
And the final major step in cementing this democratic transformation was joining Europe.
Right. Portugal entered the European Community, the precursor to the EU, on January 1st, 1986. This was 23 years after the end of the Salazar regime and served as a hugely significant signal of the democratic transformation being consolidated. Locking it in, you could say. Portugal joined alongside Greece and Spain as part of that southern enlargement of the EC.
Did the EC play a role even before membership? In the lead-up?
Yes, the sources mention that the EC played a hand in brokering some of the pre-accession reforms needed in Portugal, nudging them along. Portugal also strategically adopted a plan of learning from the experiences of Greece and Spain, the other recent entrants, to help guide its own integration process. Smart move.
Let's pivot now, maybe explore Portuguese culture and society a bit more, especially how this long, complex history shaped identity. The sources discuss this idea of the national.
Yeah, what's really interesting is the ongoing debate around this idea of the national identity in Portugal, particularly how it contrasts with Spain, despite their shared cultural and religious roots and that long history of, well, hostility, the material suggests Portugal experienced a relatively late Europeanization compared to some others. It took longer to fully integrate, maybe. And interestingly, the diaspora of Portuguese communities living abroad has played a significant role in articulating major Portuguese literary works, identity being shaped from outside, too.
So identity isn't just confined to the mainland. It's broader, more spread out.
Not at all. The concept of a multi-ethnic diasporic identity is crucial here. The sources highlight how diasporic communities like Galician, Brazilian, and various African ones are mentioned are often viewed differently, perhaps more fluidly, than the Portuguese state itself, whose origin story is tied back to that specific 1139 civil war we mentioned. It's complex. But despite these internal complexities and debates, external figures like Voltaire and Tolstoy are cited as having appreciated and understood something unique about Portugal. Its identity is described as this fascinating confluence of Greek, Roman, Semitic, Germanic, and Celtic elements, a real melting pot over centuries.
And this rich history and blend of influences is so evident in the arts, isn't it? Architecture, for example.
Absolutely. Portugal has a deep and extensive tradition in art and architecture. You can literally trace it through the centuries. You've got 12th century Romanesque examples like the Porto Cathedral or Santa Cruz in Coimbra. Solid early stuff. Then the Gothic style seen in Lisbon cathedrals and Coimbra University buildings. More soaring, intricate.
And the wealth from the Age of Discovery brought a whole new flourish, a distinct style.
Exactly, the manual line style. It emerged in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, directly paralleling the wealth and influences coming from overseas. It's very decorative. It features elements like imported woods, elaborate painted ceilings, commemorative tombs, showing a high level of imaginative design. Very unique to Portugal. Later periods saw late Renaissance and Baroque influences taking hold. The 18th century is noted for its relative indifference to neoclassicism, at least until later reforms kicked in. They weren't rushing to adopt that. And more recently, from the 1960s onwards, the sources point to a wave of incredibly imaginative modern architecture, describing it as a phase of real exuberance, some amazing buildings.
What about the sounds of Portugal? The music? What do the sources say there?
The musical landscape is wonderfully diverse. It includes traditional folk music rooted in rural areas, like the canções de trabalho work songs or the vibrant ranchos dances from the Minho region in the north. Very lively. The sources mention medieval figures like the Sarafera, who apparently recited poetry accompanied by music, an early form of performance.
And city music evolved differently from the folk traditions.
Yes, particularly in Lisbon, music developed through things like masked dances, cordos featuring guitars, and it incorporated influences from palace patrons. More sophisticated, maybe. An interesting shift occurred after the 18th century. The music apparently moved away from openly ridiculing kings or highlighting social injustices, becoming, as the sources put it, more sublimized, less overtly political or satirical. We also see the development of harmony, incorporating influences like flamenco, and a distinction growing between regional hymns and the music developing in the cities.
Okay, turning our attention towards the economy now. The sources provide some historical context, particularly from the late 19th century onwards.
Right. Looking at the period between 1870 and 1910, which was framed by all those political shifts after 1820, the sources note that economic history was often studied and presented through a political lens back then, economics serving politics. There was this dominant idea of four pillars: agriculture, industry, commerce, and finance as being the path to national wealth. But agriculture in particular was often critiqued as a kind of cursed triangle, not performing well.
It sounds like Portugal wasn't exactly a front-runner in industrialization during this time compared to others.
No, the material describes Portugal as a elite and relatively slow developer during this period. It notes its low per capita GNP compared to other nations. The comparison is also made with Spain's economic struggles and decline in metropolitan markets in the 19th century. They were sort of in a similar boat there.
Bringing us much closer to the present day, what are the major contemporary economic and social challenges highlighted in the sources? What's happening now?
Well, a significant issue that comes up is public debt. The sources note it rose sharply, hitting 130% of GDP back in 2012. That's huge. And under pressure from the European Union and international lenders, the Troika's successive governments imposed really painful austerity measures.
What did those austerity measures actually involve for the average person? What did they mean?
They meant deep cuts to social benefits, like pensions and unemployment support. Big impacts there. Privatization of public services like schools and hospitals, selling things off, and increases in taxes and tariffs, hitting people's wallets directly. The government at the time often justified these measures by blaming previous left-wing governments for perceived incompetence and corruption. That was the narrative put forward, which some media echoed.
But there was significant public reaction to this, right? People didn't just accept it.
Absolutely not. There were widespread public protests, huge demonstrations, and strong criticism in other parts of the media. People were angry. What's particularly highlighted in the sources as almost an aberration for Portugal, something unusual and something the authorities seemingly struggled to handle, was the absence of violent reaction despite the severe pain caused by austerity. The protests were overwhelmingly peaceful. The material suggests that authorities actually tried to use the peaceful nature of the protests to discredit them, attempting to portray them as dangerous or fear-inducing, but ultimately failing to genuinely demonize the protests precisely because they remained peaceful. It kind of backfired.
The social welfare system is also discussed in this context, how it fared.
Yeah, since transitioning to democracy, Portugal really built out a proper social welfare state model. It was a big achievement. This expanded social protections significantly beyond just traditional pensions to cover health, education, and benefits for the unemployed and jobless. A real safety net. The sources note that this led to positive results in living standards starting in the 1980s, solidifying Portugal's status as a welfare state. However, the 2008 financial crisis and the subsequent austerity measures definitely weakened this model, even though it continued to function. It took a hit. This period also saw the phenomenon of social exclusion becoming more visible, more people falling through the cracks.
Tourism is clearly a huge part of the economy today, isn't it?
Oh, massively. It's identified as a mainstay of Portugal's economic growth and is seen as crucial for social and environmental sustainability, too. Its contribution to national production and employment has grown significantly. Lots of jobs depend on it. And it plays a key role in regional growth, helping to decrease economic imbalances between different parts of the country, which is important.
What makes Portugal such a strong tourism destination, according to the material? What's the draw?
Well, the sources credit Portugal's diverse endowments. Its beaches, obviously, but also its rich history, museums, natural landscapes, unique wines, regional products, that vibrant culture we talked about. It's got a lot to offer. The government has clearly prioritized the sector with strategic plans like PENT, that's the National Strategic Plan for Tourism, aimed at maintaining Portugal's competitive ranking and developing tourism as a core industry. They know it's vital. However, the sources also point to the challenge of regional competition, especially for less developed areas trying to compete with the huge drawing power of Lisbon and the Algarve. Hard to match those hotspots.
And finally, the sources look at environmental awareness over time. Has that been a long-standing concern?
It seems environmental concerns have a history stretching back about 60 years, actually, starting with the creation of organizations like the Liga para a Proteção da Natureza way back in 1948. Protests started emerging more visibly in the mid-60s and 70s, specifically defending natural areas like Praia de Rocha or the Arabada Hills, and opposing infrastructure projects like certain wastewater treatment plants or even metro stations if they impacted sensitive areas.
Were those early movements effective? Did they achieve much?
Well, the material gives examples. There's a mention of the significant Alquiva Dam project in the 90s, which, after years of mobilization and opposition, was miraculously canceled. So yes, sometimes. The sources also discuss attempts to create official environmental commissions within Portugal, influenced by global events like the Earth Summit. Some of these initial attempts are described less favorably, like one meeting with apparently no real debate, or a plan that was called ridiculous, leading to criticism. Bit of a bumpy start. Before or later, more successful commission was apparently established in a less public way by a small group with specific academic expertise, maybe learning from mistakes.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's crystal clear Portugal is a country shaped by incredible highs and some really significant challenges.
It truly is, a place with such a unique history and cultural identity. The material really underscores its historical importance as a European country with extensive overseas territories, and its early role in globalization, significantly shaped by its specific geopolitical situation right there on the edge of Europe facing the Atlantic. That position is key.
Yeah, we've traced a path from ancient settlements through that massive global expansion, periods under foreign rule and regaining independence, major reforms, those big transitions from monarchy to dictatorship to democracy, and finally to contemporary struggles and its place in modern Europe. Quite the ride.
And despite those dramatic shifts and periods of difficulty, the sources describe Portugal's overall development, perhaps surprisingly, as having been, quote, tranquil and dignified. Even though its major economic development is really concentrated in the 20th and 21st centuries, it found a way through. And that physical description we started with, a small, roundish country at Europe's southwest extreme, mountainous, but with that crucial coast, it feels like a physical representation of its history, doesn't it? Tied to both land and sea.
Absolutely. So, what does this entire journey through the material suggest for you, the listener? Here's a thought. How does Portugal's extraordinary history of navigation, its cultural confluence, drawing from so many influences, and its demonstrated resilience in the face of huge challenges, be it foreign rule, dictatorship, or economic austerity, how does all that continue to shape its identity and its influence today, both within that widespread Portuguese-speaking community around the world and its place within contemporary Europe?
Or perhaps another way to think about it is, how does a country that seems so defined by paradoxes, that bizarre beauty we mentioned, a peaceful revolution emerging from dictatorship, struggling with debt while maintaining a welfare state, how does it successfully balance its incredibly rich history and global past with the very real social and economic realities it faces right now?
Definitely something to keep exploring.